Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com. If you caught Philosophy Friday, I was talking about listening to older mixes where I was hearing full mix downs from like 5 years ago, and then comparing them to newer records, some of which were really only just the studio roughs, and finding the studio roughs were better. Now, this was a critical examination of how I could improve over my old mixes, but it's also important to note that my studio roughs were coming out pretty good. And I thought about that and I realized it's because I've been focusing a lot on my tracking techniques. So I thought I'd make a video about certain things that are making my tracking system a lot more effective and therefore also giving me better roughs at the end of the day. Now, this is absolutely a clickbait title, 10 things that hack tracks or track hacks, or I don't know what I'm going to call it yet, but it's definitely intended to be clickbait. That said, I think you're going to find this stuff useful. The only catch is that I track in Pro Tools, and most of my videos on this channel are not Pro Tools specific, but unfortunately, this one is going to be. That said, no matter what DAW you are using, there's probably a mechanism there that you can use to take these ideas and incorporate them into your own system. Hopefully, when I'm able to grow this channel, I'll be able to get content providers who specialize in other DAWs, but until then, gonna have to bear with me. Okay, let's jump in. Let's take a look at this. This is my tracking template. I'm just gonna be working from this while I go down this list here. And I want to start with number 1. This is really, really useful, and that is insert groups. So here I have my backing vocal tracks ready to go for my tracking template. And you'll notice that there are 3 plugins on all of these. There is a trim plugin right in the front, there is tuning, and then there is RComp. The reason I have a compressor on my background vocal tracks is because when you're stacking up layers, a lot of the times you don't want big dynamic shifts coming from the left, going to the right, because it's going to scatter the image around. And unfortunately, you can't put a compressor on the bus because when one side triggers the compressor, even if you're in multiple mono mode, you're going to be ducking out stuff that doesn't need to duck out. So I have it individually on every channel. Now, normally, it would be a little bit of a pain if I had to adjust all of these compressors because I'd have to adjust one at a time. However, right now I've got my background vocal left pulled up. I'm going to pull up my background vocal right as well. Now, watch what happens if I move the threshold on one of them. The other one moves as well. All of the parameters are linked. This is super useful if I need to set the compressor for the background vocals and I want them all to have the same setting. So the way that I set this up is in the groups. Normally, when you create a group, you end up following globals as a default, and the globals might be volume, mute, maybe pan. What you want to do is unclick follow globals, go down to mix, check out your attributes, and you want to make sure that volume, mute, and pan are not checked. Especially pan if you're doing background vocals because you're clearly going to be wanting to pan things in different places. What you do want to have checked is the controls and the bypass. These are insert lanes, and this is going to allow you to control one insert from another as long as it's the exact same plugin. So here, the first 3 inserts of this group are all controllable together. Okay, number 2, markers. I mean, this seems a little bit obvious, but being able to get around a session is very, very helpful. You might be at one point in a session and you may have to jump over to a completely different thing. So if you have your markers set up ahead of time, that's super useful. If the artist is like, hey, could you jump over to the hook? You can just click right next to it. The other thing that you can do is use a hotkey command. So if the artist says, hey, could you go over to the first hook? I can hit period 3 period and my cursor will move right over to where that hook occurs. So markers, super helpful for getting around. All right, multiple record tracks. So in many, many instances of templates that you'll see on the internet, that maybe sometimes you're buying templates, you'll see a record track, and that's generally color-coded red. It's pretty universal. And then you'll have what's called, oftentimes called dump tracks underneath. So when you get the takes that you want, you pull them down to the tracks underneath. This is very effective, but I've taken it one step further. I have a record lead, and I also have a record background vocal. This way, when we're working on lead takes, I'm doing it all over here, And then if I want to work on background takes, I can do it all over here. This allows me to set up my background vocals a little differently for the record track and the monitoring. This also allows me to not have to pull things down through 1,000 tracks of audio if I'm recording up here. So I highly recommend it. Also, if you have multiple artists in the same session, you can duplicate your record lead, and that can be very helpful as well. Okay, lastly, as far as setup goes, let's say we're tracking and suddenly the artist gets like too close to the microphone and there's a plosive boom, like a big sub boom that happens from a p or a b sound. Well, I can eliminate that pretty easily by pulling up destructive editing. Now, normally when you pull up destructive editing in Pro Tools, you'll have to go to the audio suite, you'll have to pull up the EQ, and then maybe you have a preset for it, but maybe you don't. Notice I did that with just one quick little move, right? The way that I did that was with a configuration window, and my first configuration window is this specific EQ. It is for cleaning up little things along the way where maybe there's a plosive that overbooms, or maybe there's a ring in the room or a vocal node where the note is really good, but it just creates a resonance that's very annoying. So I have these 4 different little EQs. One's a high pass, 3 of them are notch filters, and they're all in bypass to begin with, but then I use the one that I need. Now, how do you set up a configuration window? Well, the way you do it is you go into the audio suite, and let's say that you want to do, I don't know, a reverse reverb, something like that. So you would pull up the reverb that you like for your reverse reverb, and then you would go over to configurations, and you would go over to new configuration, and you would just save it that way. And if this is the 3rd configuration, in order to pull it up instantly, I would hit period 3 star, and that would immediately pull up Deverb. I only keep 2 of them. I'll probably build a few more. I have my cleanup EQ, and then the other one that I have is Waves Tune, because sometimes a note will grab in a weird way against maybe like auto tune or meta tune or whatever tuning you're tracking through, and so you just need a quick little fix. And I find that Waves Tune GUI is the easiest to just do quick little tiny repairs, so I like to use Waves Tune. All right, now when we're tracking, a really important mode is relative grid mode. Our default mode is going to be grid mode. The problem with grid mode is that whenever you chop a little segment, if you try to move it, it's going to snap to wherever the beginning of that region is, it's going to move over to the grid. If you're in relative grid mode, it's not going to do that. What it will do is keep your region in the same temporal spot relative to the grid. So if you're setting quarter notes, you'll just be shifting it over by quarter notes, but it's going to stay relatively in the same spot. This is very, very useful because a lot of the times when you're tracking, you end up recording in places that you don't necessarily want to dump directly down to. So for example, let's say that I was recording this. I'm going to use a click track here just so I can kind of keep my own time. Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, weiss-sound.com. Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, weiss-sound.com. Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, weiss-sound.com. Now let's say I want to use that 3rd one. What I would do, sorry about that. What I would do is I would separate the region, drag it down, and then in relative grid mode, notice that I'm staying in the same sort of relative spot wherever I drag it. And in this particular case, I could actually switch over to bars, and here it's going to stay in the same spot relative to the bars that I'm dragging. All right. Pretty cool. Now, the big issue with relative grid mode is what if you want to cut your region somewhere that isn't exactly on the grid? The problem is I'm moving my cursor everywhere to the grid. I can't move in between. What if I want to snip closer to the region? Well, my next little tip here is if you hold Control, you ignore the grid lock, and you can get closer to where you want to make your cut. So now I can make my cut here, I can shift it over, make my cut there, drag it down. All right, cool. Now, speaking of control, one of the most annoying things in the world when we're dragging regions down is when you lose, like you have to go down through like 1,000 things and then you slip off and suddenly you're over here, you're over here. You just wanted to drag it straight down. The way that you can do that is by holding Control. And if you do that, no matter where I move left to right, it's going to stay in the same spot. That's really helpful for moving things down when you have to go through a whole bunch of audio. Speaking of control, another really valuable key command is control slash. This is going to automatically generate a playlist. Now, I want to put a little modifier on this concept. If I'm playlisting, it's probably because there's something specific that I'm going to want to hear. So let's say that I really like this second take right here. So I want to grab the second take. This is going to be my main take. I'm going to drag it down. I'm going to put it where it needs to be. And so be it, right? However, I might like the ending of the third take. Maybe it's not the one that I'm necessarily going to use, but maybe I want to investigate it later. What I'm going to do is I'm going to double click and rename and say check end of third take. I'm going to make that the name of the playlist. Now I'm going to create a new playlist and I'm going to change it to record lead. So this way I now have my record lead back, but if I go into my playlists, I have check end of third take already written in there, which is really, really convenient because then I know why I have the playlist and what I'm going to be checking for. Now, I'm a big fan of getting as close to a finished everything along the way. I want my studio bounce to be like perfect if I can get it. That's why I have things like the configuration window, right? I can do those edits on the fly, but there's certain edits on the fly that really just everybody should be doing as a matter of habit. One of them is going to be clip gain. So if we look at these regions, for example, let's say I pulled the second one in, you'll notice that there's a little bit of spikiness that's happening right at the front of this. I can go in here, I can grab these, I can hit Command E and then Shift Control and scroll and lower the gain of just this individual region. That's really, really useful. If you do this consistently through a tracking session, you'll find that getting your compression settings correct later down the line much, much easier because you never have to worry about things being too uneven to begin with. The one thing I will say, though, is you can't really do this visually. You do have to get a feel for how these are going to sound because sometimes just because the GUI is telling you that there's a big dynamic doesn't mean that it's going to sound like the dynamic is as big as it really is. So you do have to judge more by ear than by eye, and that does take a little getting used to. The other thing that I think is really important to adjust along the way is timing. So for me, I always keep my nudge at 300 when I'm tracking at 44.1 or 48. I don't know why 300 samples is what speaks to me, but that's like the smallest increment of value in which I can really discern a timing difference. I've seen people do 100. There are a couple of times where maybe I've done 100 because it did make a difference, but that's pretty rare. Now, if you happen to be working 88.2 or 96, you have to double this. You have to make it 600 because each sample is now taking half the amount of time. So you'd be doing 600, but a multiple of 300 is what's going to work. And then once you have that up as your sample nudge, then if something's just a little early, feels a little early, or feels a little late, you can hit your little arrow brackets and you can shift it in time pretty easily. Okay, lastly, know your control commands, your command control, your tool control command. You know what I'm trying to say. Learn how to switch between your tools. So this is going to vary from person to person. Some people like to work with the multi-tool. I used to work with the multi-tool predominantly. When I have bigger windows open, I find that it's easier to do because it's easier to place things where they need to go in order to get the correct tool that you're looking for. But some people don't like the multi-tool. So Command 7 gets you to the multi-tool, but if you like to use individual tools, use Command 2 for your region tool, Command 3 for your selector tool, and Command 4 for your grabber tool. And being able to jump between those very fast can be very, very helpful. Experiment, see what works better for your workflow, and use the one that works for you. So with that said, that is 10 tips that should make your tracking a lot better. And if you're approaching tracking from a better systemized way, you're going to be able to focus on getting better takes, better sounds, and really just everything else along the way. And ultimately, you're going to end up with something where once the tracking is complete, really it should be pretty easy to get a at least fairly decent mix going pretty fast. So, alright guys, if you dig this video, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, hit subscribe with the bell notification so you get notified. If you have any questions about anything that you've seen, or if you have a question about how to do this in your DAW of choice, ask that in the comments section below. Either myself or somebody from the community will help you out for your DAW. And lastly, you know what we say at WeissAdvice.com. We are musicians. Sound is our instrument. I will catch you next time.